Good morning, everybody, and very warm welcome to the ones who have joined us to our third day AMA on repair, healing, and care. I welcome again Brooke Andrew, who is on stage since this morning and last night. We already had an amazing session with Pedro from the TV Island, and now I'm very, very pleased to welcome Marcia Langton from Melbourne. Before I introduce Marcia, and I think we're all so excited that she's joining, I want to say a few words about Brooke Andrew, who's a researcher, scholar, artist, and curator. He's part of our team who's working on the project, which is these 4 days, these research days for us to learn from our neighborhood here directly in Berlin, but also from international experts about the subject we're thinking about since 2018 and have done many kind of separate shows to basically approach these themes. And now we've decided to do these 4 days. Brooke is a Celtic Wiradjuri artist. Sorry, I know I should pronounce this better, but I'm learning during these days. He has curated, for me, one of the most exciting and important biennials in the last years, the Nireen, which was in 2019 in Sydney, 2020. It was the 22nd Biennale. It was First Nation and artist-led, and really, I think, groundbreaking in relation to doing biennales. And that's also when I met Marcia for the last time, I think, and so now she's joining from Melbourne. We decided that I do read her biography because we feel she's such an important scholar, and I think you will right away dive in. So I will just tell you a bit about Marcia. Professor Marcia Langton is a descendant of the Yemen people of Queensland. She's qualified as an anthropologist and geographer, and since 2000 has held the foundation chair of Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne. Her current research concerns alcohol management and domestic and family violence in Aboriginal settings and Indigenous data governance and community data projects. She has produced a large body of knowledge in the areas of political and legal anthropology and Aboriginal arts and culture. She has published and presented and Indigenous agreements and engagement with the minerals industry, Aboriginal land tenures, native title, and Indigenous research management. In 2016, Professor Langton was honored as the University of Melbourne Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor, and from May 2017 has been the Associate Provost. So, is she here with us?
Hi, Marcia.
Very, very warm welcome to both of you. Just to also say, before I hand over, you can take off your masks while you're sitting, so you don't have to, breathing becomes a little bit easier. We're very tight with time because we have many talks today, so poor Brooke has to be the timekeeper with his lamps here. So I'll hand over right away so that we don't lose more time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mandangu, Stephanie. Hi, everyone, and again, thank you to the technical and awesome team putting AMA together. And Yama, Marcia, how are you?
Oh, thank you, Brooke.
We can't hear you very well.
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good. Can everyone hear that okay? Maybe we could turn it up a little bit. So Marcia, welcome to Berlin. We know it's 9 o'clock at night there in Melbourne, and you've been very busy. So I just want to, thank you very much for taking the time to spend with us your evening, and thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction of the extraordinary career, and also a very dear family member of mine and mentor, Marcia, and her daughter Ruby, who I know is visiting you from Sydney because the borders just came down between New South Wales and Victoria. It's another story. But Marcia, before we kick off and really talk about healing and your work in that area, I was just wondering if you'd like to share your PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah.
Here we go. I was. Could you maybe, we'll be talking about kinship caring, repairing, healing, and really going out to the Western Desert and looking at some of the kinship connections there as well. But I'm just wondering, have you got the map there of Aboriginal countries? The next slide. Okay, here we go. So this is the map of Australia, those of you who have not seen this before. There's over 300 different nations and languages, etc. And it's really important to kind of in some ways talk about sovereignty as well. Marcia, I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about your work with The Voice, it's called, and you were appointed by the very first Minister for Indigenous Peoples, Minister White, who is Indigenous himself for the first time in Australian history, which is extraordinary. Could you maybe talk about a little bit about The Voice and when it talks about recognition within the Constitution?
So you can see on the map that there are many Aboriginal languages and tribes. This is called, amongst those of us work in this area, the Horton map. It was devised by David Horton, quite sure of the methodology, but it is based in very large part on the Norman Tyndale map and surveys from the 1940s. He was a physical anthropologist, an American physical anthropologist who, practiced that very typical 1940s eugenicist anthropology. He measured heads and head shapes, body size, took photographs, and he collected thousands of files on individual Aboriginal people and wrote down their language affiliations or tribal names. So the map is a bit of a mishmash, and there's usually a warning on the map to say that this map should not be relied on in native title claims, but it's useful for any audience in explaining the great diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So Indigenous Australia is made up of Aboriginal Australia, who are the descendants of people who came here 65,000 years ago or more, and also the Torres Strait Islanders who live between Cape York and New Guinea. And that's actually a very large archipelago. It doesn't look like it on the map, but it's large. And the Torres Strait Islanders have been there for about 20,000 years. Australia, as you know, was colonised about 250 years ago by the British. And when the white colonists in the 6 separate colonies decided to do something about unifying the colonies as a nation in the late 19th century, they held a series of constitutional conventions and wrote a constitution based on the principle of Australia for the white man.
Marcia, sorry to interrupt. I'm just wondering if you could speak a bit closer to the mic. We're just having a bit trouble. Thank you.
Sorry. So the Australian Constitution was drafted by white male colonists in the late 1900s at a series of conventions. Is that better?
Yeah.
And they excluded Aboriginal people entirely from the Constitution. And there were several racist clauses in the Constitution. 2 of them were removed in 1967 at a referendum when Australians voted on a campaign to remove those 2 racist clauses. But it didn't solve the problem because the Constitution remains formally racist in that there's a race power in the Constitution. So the Parliament of Australia can make laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people now, but it can do so to their detriment. It's a very complicated area of law, so I won't go on about it, but for a very long time, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have wanted recognition in the Constitution, recognition of us as First Peoples. And I think our campaign's been running for at least 15 years. And in late 2019, Minister Ken Wyatt appointed 52 of us to a co-design group to design an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Now, we represent only 3% of the Australian population, and yet, as you can see, Aboriginal people live all over the country and are the First Peoples, descended from people who arrived 65,000 years ago, and yet we are not recognised in the Constitution. So we've presented a report on how Indigenous people might have their voice heard in the Parliament. The final report was submitted to the Minister in July, and we're waiting for the Cabinet to consider it. Now, this came about because of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. In 2017, 250 Aboriginal delegates attended the first National Indigenous Constitutional Convention at Uluru in Central Australia. And they wrote a statement, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, addressed to all Australians, calling for a voice, a treaty commission called a Makarrata, and truth-telling. So our voice co-design process, resulting in the final report, which isn't yet public, resulted from that Uluru Statement from the Heart. And there have been other developments as well. In 3 jurisdictions now, we have treaty processes. The most advanced one is in Victoria, where there's legislation and a treaty commission that's called the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. There's also a treaty process commenced in Queensland, and also a quite advanced process in the Northern Territory, where there's a treaty commissioner and assistant commissioners. And also in Victoria, an act has been passed establishing the URUC Truth-Telling and Justice Commission, which has the powers of a Royal Commission to investigate matters that come under the rubric of truth-telling about the past, the historical past, in relation to what happened to Aboriginal people. So Australia had a very violent colonisation, extremely violent. There is, in fact, now a major research project mapping all of the massacres, the documented massacres across Australia. And they're progressively working their way, the researchers are progressively working their way from the east coast of Australia to the west coast of Australia, and they're about halfway across the continent. And there are hundreds of massacre sites. Look it up online. It's called Frontier Massacres. And each dot on the map represents a massacre, and there are supporting documents, historical documents that are summarised with body counts and details of what happened, dates and so on. So this backdrop of a brutal colonisation and the denial of our civil rights, constitutionally and legally, and yet here we are 250 years later still arguing for our rights, I think needs to be understood as, you know, part of the picture when we talk about kinship. So as you can imagine, not many of those kinship systems have survived intact. There are several, but, you know, a large part of our population is now urbanised or living in rural towns and denied for many years the right to speak our own languages. And with the loss of language, you also get loss of cultural detail like kinship terminologies and all that goes with it. But there are resonances of the ancient kinship traditions amongst most Aboriginal people. And we still practice those traditions of recognising each other as kin. So even though Brooke and I have no biological relationship, still passes me as family and vice versa. And that's because of an ancient tradition of adopting each other as kinfolk, even if there is no biological connection.
Thank you, Marcia. I mean, I think it's important to note here too, when you talk about the frontier and also when you've reflected on your country and massacres that have happened, you know, in your traditional lands, the pain that we still feel, the intergenerational trauma, really needs a lot of modern Gidyal, which is healing in Wiradjuri. And so therefore us, it's a very ongoing healing process, not just only about constitutionally and being recognised in our own country, but it is this ongoing healing that we're always having to perform. And I'm wondering if you'd like to talk a little bit about that and maybe segue into the slide, the next slide.
Sure. Well, I did want to say about kinship that from an Aboriginal perspective, kinship links us all and to the world around us. So it's not just a kinship terminology like English kinship terminology that, you know, gives us terms for mother, father, brother, sister. Aboriginal kinship encompasses a great deal more. So it's a kind of social logic, and it's obviously all of those, especially those surviving intact kinship systems, must be very ancient, and they explain the world in relation to all known human and non-human phenomena and create a network of relatedness. And that's what we inherit. We inherit this network of relatedness. And it classifies and names not just people and their familial relationships, but also many other people, so that all become related. Potentially everybody's related to each other, in other words. And if we can make a connection, we establish a kinship connection and the kinship names that we will call each other. And if we can't establish a biological connection, we create one. But also the kinship systems include all named living things, including features of our environment, celestial bodies, and sacred ancestors and ancestors, as well as the places and land and sea estates. So this goes to your question. Ancestors are not forgotten. And the massacres create, if you like, a double burden. Not only do we know that many of our people were killed, murdered, in each family, we have stories of that. We might learn about it as adults in a library, as records come to light. But also, you see, we have these great absences in our social life because so many people were murdered or died from disease during the colonial invasion. it's very difficult for people to create firm linkages back to their ancestral places. And so a great deal of our time is spent doing research and talking to each other, interviewing kinfolk to ensure that we have the best possible chance of re-establishing those relationships with the past. My daughter went up to a big tribal get-together recently. Well, it was actually just a few years ago, for a native title determination, and we tried to go this year when a sacred stone was returned to country, the Star of Taroom. But we were in lockdown because of the pandemic. And so, you know, with a highly urbanised population, these gatherings are tremendously important. And you know, so you have these modern day ceremonies and markers to bring us together, such as, you know, returning, when there are sacred objects being returned, people get together to celebrate that. Unfortunately, we missed out, but we plan to go and see it as soon as we are allowed into Queensland. So these massacres have what are called, you know, what's called at the impact of intergenerational trauma. And this intergenerational trauma causes mental ill health and physical ill health. And there's more and more research on that. And it's and so when people talk about healing and truth-telling, it is a nationwide challenge to find ways to overcome the legacy of the colonial invasion, and to make people whole, and to make families whole, and to make genealogies whole, and to do our best to restitute our cultural heritage. All of these are acts of healing.
Thanks, Marcia. And I mean, as Marcia was saying before about finding evidence of massacres, etc., a lot of this was hidden. It was deliberately hidden. It was made invisible. The denial of these and other actions have been and still continue today. And in regards to the massacre map, the digital massacre map Marcia was talking about before, on the Frontier Wars, I myself found a private letter sent from a James Dixon from the Snowy Mountains region of Victoria back to his friend in England in 1854, and he described a massacre of where 17 Aboriginal people were murdered. And this I forwarded on to that project. And so it's really through these means and other research that Marcia's reflected on that we form these kind of historical spaces that also help with kinship and healing. So Marcia, I love this painting. I've seen it before.
Yes, so this is, I understand, Ngora 2. There are 2 paintings like this. And 24 years ago now, the first one was painted by 40 claimants in the Great Western Desert. So they were making a native title claim, and they gathered in Lake Pinini to demonstrate their claim to land through art. And this resulted in a 5 by 10 metre canvas, now in the National Museum of Australia in Canberra. Then they thought about it and decided that it was too small and should involve more people. So they were creating a kinship network across the Western Desert and bringing in more claimants to land. So this one is the larger one, and it depicts a vast landscape with its sacred waterholes, or Jilla, and soaks, Juma, across the desert. And there's a line that represents the Canning stock route created by colonists. So the native title claim was finally heard in 1997, and the native title tribunal members travelled to Lake Pinini, where each artist stood on the section they painted and spoke about their connection to country in their own language. And this painting became crucial evidence in their claim for native title. But it took another 10 years before it was officially recognised. And so then a few years ago, this second painting was returned to the people in the Great Western Desert. And then the new generations came out and stood with the painting. So it had been 20 years. So this is the 20th anniversary. So this was 4 years ago of the painting. And this is a lovely photograph from the Kimberley Land Council website. And so all of the people gathered together, and their ceremonial gathering had the purpose of awakening the painting, waking the painting up. And this is a map of that part of the Western Desert. So this is in the far northwest of Australia, and it's the top part of the Great Western Desert. So it's a very large area, apparently the size of Tasmania. So I thought I'd give that as an example of how people are using their kinship connections, their ancestral connections, and their cultural toolkits to heal and restitute their social lives and their societies. I might, in fact, go back to it just so that people can see the painting again, because it is such a beautiful painting, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing about this too, because in the previous talk we were talking with Pedro Winamiri and the Yoi, and the big difference between Indigenous law and white law in Australia, and really, and also what you're talking about, intergenerational trauma and how it's taken hundreds of years for us to even get representation in Australian court. These massive paintings, are the evidence. And many people, even if they've painted these connections to country and they connect to other families in the region, doesn't necessarily mean that they are actually going to get land returned and they'll have a successful land claim. And that brings about quite a lot of trauma, Marcia.
Yeah. So I think out of the 2,000 and something native title claims lodged, only 542 have been determined. But there have been some consent determinations. And I think there's a growing recognition that, the whole native title legal regime is unjust. And that is why, land return schemes in the states and also by the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation are so important. Because so many people will never have their rights recognised. Because the courts expect us to prove our connections to country when, generations were massacred. The massacres in my grandfather's country went on for decades. And yet the courts expect us to find an unbroken link in the records back to pre-annexation times. This is an extremely unjust system. But I just want to use the example of that painting to show how kinship and country are, interchangeable.
And of course, there are other policies, the policy of segregation, assimilation, the removal of children. You've probably heard of the stolen generations, etc. I mean, it's kind of like, layers upon layers upon layers of division, and yet, as Marcy's explaining, we still have to create a map of how we're connected. And so therefore, Ngangkari is also, they're healers as well, but maybe we could go back. Do you want to go back to that really wonderful illustration in language about people's interconnectivity?
Yeah. So Ngangkari are traditional healers, and over a 10-year period, I would see them each year in my role as the patron of the Nganadara Pitjantjatjara Yankunytjatjara Women's Council. And these desert kinship systems are just beautiful. So not only does a kinship network stretch back through the generations beyond grandparents and great-grandparents and into the distant past, but also outwards socially. Now, Ngangkari inherit healing powers, and they are also trained throughout their lives. And the Ngangkari have a service based in Alice Springs. Of course, they lived all through the Central Desert, and they were extremely concerned about the mental health and well-being of young people. So they devised a series of interventions, including this wonderful poster. So if you can see some of the detail of it, so up in the top, for instance, it says Mukurinku Pai Pulanku, start to have girlfriend, boyfriend. So there's a tiny little figure of a boy and a girl kind of being nervous around each other. Then over to the left is Kaping Urpa, a woman who is expecting. Mama Ngunchur Pula, become parents themselves. On the corner of the street is a screaming baby. Chichi, Katarati, Jararingu, getting teeth. So what they've done is put onto this wonderful cartoon people going about their business in this little Aboriginal township with all of the states of being that the Ngangkari think are important transition points or experiences that everybody has, and they've provided the classical language so that people can talk about these things. They've got the term for teenage girl, baby crawling, baby standing up, baby rolling over, young children playing together, a younger sibling comes along, child got big, grandfather teaching hunting, sitting down eating. So they've provided the English and the Pitjantjatjara to enable parents or people in all generations, parents and young people, to talk about their state of being. And they've also created, along with this series of posters, fridge magnets. And each fridge magnet has the term for a state of being in language and in English. And you can put them on your fridge so that everybody can learn to talk to each other about how they're feeling. So this is the Ngangkari's intervention, right into your kitchen, into your mother's group, into your school, to give everybody the language to talk to each other so that people can show concern and help those who are not doing well. Somewhere in here, there's an image of a person who's very, very depressed. I can't see it at the moment, but what they want us to do is to notice when somebody's depressed and have the language to speak to them. Oh, sorry, this is Ngangkari, not Pitjantjatjara.
So, Marcia, I mean, really, this map is showing that healing or Ngangkari and what they see is important is really the kind of interconnectivity of everything, which really shouldn't be a taboo. And I'm just wondering, we only have 9 minutes left. Would you like to continue, or maybe take some questions from the audience?
I'll leave that to you, Brooke.
Maybe if we can just get a sample of the audience. Does anyone like to ask a question of Marcia? Yeah, we've got one. Is that Natasha? Yeah. Marcia, did you want to talk about very quickly about kinship in law, or would you like to take some questions?
Well, I just wanted to say this is a photograph of the Kununurra police station. Oh, not the Kununurra police station. It's a police station at a mine site.
Mine side.
Near south of Kununurra. And you can see the painting of the two serpents on the police station. And the elders in the region instructed that the serpents be painted onto the police station because young people had attacked the police very violently and they put 2 police in hospital. And the elders wanted everyone to know that their law and the whitefellow law were working together and that everybody had to look after each other. So this is how they sent their message out to everybody. They put the sacred snakes over the door of the police station. So kinship is law too. When people found out what these young people did, they were very, very upset. And the police had never seen anything like it. And the police themselves, when they knew that they wanted to do this, funded the whole project. And there's more to it than that. They did a version of a sacred waterhole with more sacred paintings out the front of the police station as well. And so they were then able to conduct smoking ceremonies for all visitors. So this is a photograph of the women elders, many of them healers, smoking ministers and dignitaries during a negotiation over Aboriginal rights to country in this mining province. You can see a photo of me up the back with the red headband on my head. I'm standing back so that they can smoke the Kimberley Land Council officials and government officials. And this is their way of getting people to understand that Aboriginal law runs in this country and elsewhere. This is their way of doing it through making people stand in the sacred smoke.
Thank you, Marcia. And I think that, the great example or, I suppose, comparison is that when you go to a Christian church, there might be incense, there might be other relics or other ceremonies. So really, it's very similar in many ways. And as Marcia was saying, these women are saying, this is our country, you're under our law now. Marcia, are you okay? Maybe we ask what this question is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. It's really precious the way you're also just sharing from this extended relationship between the two of you. And I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about actually how your kinship also extends into the artistic forms in which you work, Brooke, together with Marcia. That might be interesting also because you will participate as an artist as well in the exhibition, and just this relation, of course, is such a crucial one for you, which is clear. And I also wondered if there's time thinking about also this question of, while carrying this double burden, as Marcia put it, the element also of what it means then for communities to decide who has access to certain kinds of lands and certain, especially also spaces of water. I know there's also a gender access question. There's a question of who from the outside of the community can access a place. And I wanted to learn a bit more about that within the areas where Marcia's actively working.
Thanks, Natasha. And we've only got 4 minutes of big questions. I mean, it's another hour, but it's so great to hear enthusiasm. Marcia, did you want to respond to some of that?
Oh, well, I've written, Brooke asked me to write catalogue essays about his work. So I've interviewed him and, sat in his studio and talked to him about his work and written quite a few catalogue essays. We've also worked together on a project, Brooke's project on memorialisation. How do we memorialise the ancestors who were murdered during the colonial invasion? So that was the first time that the Australian Research Council had funded an artist, and an Indigenous artist at that. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that project.
Yeah, sure. So Marcia is my mentor in life anyway, and much more. And maybe just as a nod to what you were saying before, Marcia, about our relationship to inanimate and other animals in our lives. So my grandmother gave me Gardel, which is the magpie, so that's my middle name. And so whenever I was around when she was alive, she just knew I was looking after her. So that's one example of the importance of these. And also the Jiri, which is the Millie Wagtail. If we see that dancing, it's a messenger. And well, in for Wiradjuri country and for some other people, it's different. So it really is a kind of, it's not just superstition, it's the way in which things have been happening for 60,000 years. So there's this real kind of strong bond. And but the memorial project was looking at the international comparative to the lack of trauma sites in Australia, or the lack of memorials, the lack of recognition, but also how other cultures do this. So how in Cambodia the killing fields do this, how they expose the bones of those who were murdered, where in our culture the bones are really kind of a no-go area. It's very sacred, and this is why we're also looking at the human remains trade that happened from Australia. Many museums overseas have human remains, of course, from not only Australia, but the significance of that, and Marcia is a very important person in that field as well. But we also we came to Berlin and looked at the way in which that memorial sites become part of the urban landscape and that kind of visibility, and also to the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo and how they eventually had a memorial now in Santiago and a few other places. So really an international comparative research. And so what that led us to is really 3 case studies, and one of them, and this is all very much embedded in healing, and one of them is the National Resting Place. And Marcia, we just have 1 minute, and could you maybe just reflect on the National Resting Place and what that is?
So from colonial times until very recently, there was a trade in Aboriginal human remains, to the extent that there were people who murdered Aboriginal people to obtain the bones and the skulls and the body parts and traded them internationally. And also there were grave robbers who stole Aboriginal bodies out of their graves and sold them to the body parts to universities, to departments of anatomy and medicine and so on, and also to anthropologists and museums in pursuit of race science, racist, the racist eugenicist so-called science or pseudoscience that was fashionable for more than 150 years here in Australia, originated in 17th century Germany, I believe. And so Aboriginal people have wanted their ancestral remains returned. The Australian government has worked with us to have overseas collections returned to Australia. There's so much more work to do. And because there are so many thousands of these ancestral remains, and many of them are unprovenanced, we, over the years, the idea formed of having a national resting place in Canberra to house the unprovenanced remains, in the hope that one day we could find the documentation or use DNA to return them to their families. So that's just a quick summary of that.
That's perfect timing, because I think the gong is about to go. But Marcia, I just wanted to thank you very much for joining us on this late evening for you, and I wish you a restful evening.
Thank you, Brooke. It's been wonderful to be with you.
It's good to see you.
And thanks
I miss
to all
you.
your friends at Sprout.
Thank you.